Hey guys, in case you didn't notice, I have completely shattered my planned weekly schedule for these devlogs, and that was mostly due to two things. One, these devlogs actually take ever so slightly longer than a week to make, believe it or not, and that means that after two devlogs I was about a day off of my whole schedule. And secondly, since the video was mostly based on the technical aspect of what I had done that week, I would have had to do so many animations, which are definitely the hardest part of making these videos, on top of the fact that it would have been a really short episode only talking about Yoku Blocks and Heatman's AI and ability. I put it off for a while until I got sick. That delayed the devlog even more, since even though I was able to record some good lines just before I went fully ill, I just really didn't want to edit the video. However, don't interpret these delays as a loss of passion for the project. In fact, I continue to make steady progress, which is why we're here today. Eventually, I made so much progress that putting out a devlog on only Heatman seemed useless, so today, I'm not only going to be talking about Yoku Blocks and Heatman, but also Woodman and the absolute buttload of enemies that are featured in his stage. So, let's get started. When I completed Devlog 2 and was uploading it, I thought about what was coming up next. I needed to implement Yoku Blocks for Heatman's stage, and it was the only thing, other than Heatman himself, that I needed to implement. However, I genuinely had no clue how to implement them. In case you're unaware, Yoku Blocks are quite a famous part of the Mega Man franchise. They are also called disappearing blocks in some translations, which is a fitting name considering what they do. There are 4 separate stages of Yoku Blocks, and in sequence, these stages of blocks will activate, becoming solid temporarily. Only 2 stages are ever active at once, meaning if you're standing on a block that's tied to stage 1 while stage 3 gets activated, you're gonna plummet down. My original idea for how I was going to do this was to have 4 separate types of entities tied to each stage and making it so that they each run the exact same code using their frame variable as a timer. The one difference between them would have been that each had their frame value initialized to something different, meaning that they would have appeared and disappeared at different offsets. One problem with this would have been that since each block was acting separately from each other, the infamous Yoku Block sound would have overlapped itself any time more than one block was activated per stage,
which would have sounded something like this. Yeah, not super pleasant. So instead what I did was make it so that the original entity sprite, which gets cloned to make every entity present on screen, handles activating each Yoku block. That way I can only play the sound effect within this original sprite, and you won't have any nasty overlapping. The only downside is since the clones only follow what the original sprite does and can't communicate back to it, even if no blocks get activated on this stage, the sound will still play. It is kind of annoying, but meh, there's only 4 stages anyway, so the player will likely only ever hear 1 or 2 extra sound effects, which I can live with.
Something that I haven't gone too far into in the previous videos is how I actually port the stage layouts. And the reason is because it's honestly not that interesting. I go to an online map, usually from the sprite as resource, and use it as a guide while I place down the tiles in my level editor. The tiles are also just imported images from the sprite as resource. However, this map only shows the background information. It doesn't show any enemies, so usually I also pull up a buster only playthrough so that they don't just rush through it if I pulled up a regular playthrough. Or if even that is too fast, I pull out my actual copy of Mega Man Legacy Collection and play through the level myself. The collection lets me analyze and follow enemy behaviors, but the video is nice because I can rewind and fast forward and... Wait, hold on a second. Did that Yoku block appear between stages? Okay, so as it turns out, there are actually 8 stages, they just aren't used as frequently. Now this is easily resolvable. I could just add more stages and entities into the code, but then I need to add more sound effects, and then... that would just be too much. What I ended up doing is creating a brand new global variable called SoundCue. Pretty much any object can set this variable to a sound effect name, and then at the end of the frame, only the original entity sprite will play the sound effect, meaning multiple objects can write to this variable while the sound effect only gets played once. This means I can have each Yoku block write to this variable, but only one sound effect will ever be played. This also means that if no Yoku blocks get activated, no sound effect gets written, and no sound effect will be played, fixing 2 different sound issues with this one fix. Hooray! Next I want to talk about Heatman and his AI, since it's pretty simplistic and will allow me to explain how I do most of the boss's AIs. In order to keep the code simple, instead of implementing each boss as an entity, I instead have an entirely dedicated sprite to exclusively handle the boss's AI, collision, logic, and all that stuff. This sprite has 3 variables used to manage boss behavior: state time, action time, and frame. Frame is the least important one since all it handles is the intro sequence for each boss and also animating the boss. Pretty much whenever a boss is spawned, we play the intro while counting up, and once we go over 200, we stop the intro logic and begin the actual boss logic. It is worth knowing that if at any point I accidentally set the variable back to 0, the intro animation will actually replay again and the boss will heal back to full health, so I gotta make sure to never do that. The other 2 variables are the ones actually used for boss behavior. Every single boss has them initialized to 0 and they can be used interchangeably, but typically I use state time as a countdown and action time as a tracker counting up for how long an action has been running for. In the case of Heatman, I use state time as a countdown for him tossing out his atomic fire. I use an if-else statement to only do the firing logic if action time is equal to 0, and whenever the boss gets hit, I set action time to 1, meaning the check fails and we instead run the logic for the charge attack. Within this logic, we use the action time variable as a timer for how long Heatman should remain still before launching forward into the player. Heatman's stage required very little effort since all I really need to do was add in Yoku Blocks in his AI. However, what I was really dreading was the next level in line because Woodman's stage is extremely enemy focused, meaning I would need to implement 5 whole new enemies just for this stage: Baton, Rabbit, Monking, Cuckoo, and Hot Dog. Baton was easy since I pretty much reused Telly's AI but added the distance check and unsnapped the direction as opposed to forcing it to turn in 45-degree increments. Rabbit was also pretty easy since it was a pretty simple enemy. It just jumps forward, throws 3 carrots with a long delay between each of them, and then repeats the pattern until it's dead. Hot Dog was an interesting enemy since it was the first enemy I had implemented with a teleporting in animation, but otherwise he was pretty standard. He just fires varying lengths of fire breath at the player. Monking was pretty simple too, despite his interesting terrain interactions. He jumps out from the bottom of the screen and hangs onto these platforms before jumping up and assaulting the player. Originally, I thought this was going to be the toughest enemy to implement, but then I realized that fundamentally, this is just the same as Hot Dog, an enemy that originates from a specific Y coordinate on the screen, stops at a defined height, and then does something after a short time. So in the end, he wasn't too hard, especially since his jumping was pretty similar to that of Rabbit. Cuckoo was the hardest because he was an infinitely spawning enemy like moles or peepees, but otherwise still quite simple. I couldn't get him to work exactly 1-to-1 like the original game, which is something I'm kind of trying to do, but hey, I'm not aiming for complete faithfulness here, just the best I can do and something that's still enjoyable on its own merits. But of course, we can't forget the guardian of these woodland creatures, Woodman. His animations and states were really simple to create, however what made this fight interesting is just how many moving parts there are. Woodman, his leaf shield, and the 4 leaves that he shoots up and fall back down on you all have unique code that need to be made for them. In order to make sure they all line up correctly, I use one of my favorite tricks in Scratch. Typically, variables can be set to be global for all sprites or local for this sprite only. Local variables also have the benefit of being able to be individualized between different clones of the same sprite. However, this also comes with the downside that you can't reference the original sprite's local variables, which can be limiting in some situations. Usually, if you want to reference a local variable within another sprite, you would be able to use the variable of sprite block, but this isn't a different sprite. This is technically the same sprite, so we can't reference it within the clone's code. Luckily for us, there's a pretty simple and neat trick to fix this. If we want to reference a variable from the original version of a sprite with any clone of that same sprite, what we can do is go into another sprite's code, drag out the variable of sprite block, configure it to look at the variable we want to reference, and then just drag this into the original sprite. This will now reference the variable of the original sprite within a clone's code. What I can do with this is make it so that when the original sprite boss hits a certain point in their action time variable, the leaf shield will launch forward, or the falling leaves will teleport to a location and begin falling down. Now that we've implemented both bosses, we need to add both of their abilities. First we'll talk about Woodman's ability since it's much simpler. It is the leaf shield, which when used summons a leaf shield around you and will remain protecting you until you press a direction, at which point it will fly away in that direction. To achieve this, I use the hash variable, which pretty much every single sprite in the game uses, and it's just used for a bunch of miscellaneous functions. In this case, I use it to determine what state the shield is in. In the code, we check if hash is equal to 0, and if it is, we first check if the player is holding our direction, and if they are, we set hash to 1 and our velocity to match it. Then, after this check, we simply track the player and move to their position. Now that hash is set to 1 and this check fails, we go to the else portion where we simply move in the velocity we set earlier, thus completing the leap shoot ability. Atomic Fire is a much more complex weapon since it is actually the first ever charging weapon in the whole Mega Man franchise. It required me to create 2 entirely new variables that are only used for this weapon. Here's how it works. When you hold down the fire button, a variable called Atomic Charge will start counting up. There are 3 different levels of charge. After charging for 60 frames or 2 seconds, you will begin flashing blue, and after 120 frames or 4 seconds, you will begin flashing white and blue. Once you release the button, a separate variable called Atomic Damage will be set depending on your charge. The smallest charge deals 1 damage, the second deals 3, and the final deals 4. Once we set this variable, we then create the projectile sprite. I made Atomic Damage be a global variable so that when the projectile gets destroyed, I can reset this variable back to 0 within the projectile sprite. I also had to limit the player to only being able to shoot 1 fireball at a time, since otherwise the Atomic Damage variable would have gotten overwritten by more recent sprites. Meaning if you spent 4 whole seconds charging a shot, and after releasing it you fired another small shot, not only would the charge shot get overwritten as a small charge, but you would have still spent all that weapon energy on the large shot, even though now it's a small shot. And there you have it. We have now officially completed over half of the Robot Masters for my Mega Man 2 port. Apologies for this episode taking longer than usual, but editing the videos is honestly a lot more draining than programming for me, so going forward I'll likely prioritize making progress over posting videos. Next episode might be the final one for Robot Masters, since there's only 3 left. I'm not too sure, since if I follow the pattern that I have going right now, where I do 2 robots per video, we would have another video only tackling 1 Robot Master, which I don't really want to do. Maybe I could also cover the Wily stage in that one? I'm not too sure. You guys tell me in the comments, or we'll find out next time when I decide to make the video. But until then, take care, lots of love, love you all, keep supporting videos, subscribe, like, comment, do all the things, share it please. I really like working on this, and I really want to keep working on this. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.